It's 4:55 p.m. Central Standard Time on March 24th, 2021 in Dallas, Texas. Now, this will be the first time I've attempted to offer some sort of reflection on three readings at the same time, which have a very unique composition in terms of how, when read together, they affect a particular consideration. It's first noteworthy to me about the response from the Pennsylvania House of Representatives to the governor of Pennsylvania, saying specifically they cannot understand what he's talking about. So please entreat them to a hearing, to a committee meeting, meaning assemble with us in the private realm. Is it on the record? Well, if it's on the record, it is not recounted here. If it was on the record at the time, it is not recounted for later perusal. Within the context of the presentation of the negotiations that were ongoing between the governor and the House of Representatives at the time, and context would seem to imply that what the governor put into the memorandum, which understandably was meant to be made available for consideration by those besides just the members of the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives could not find within that specific memo any justification for considering or reconsidering their decisions. I may be in need of a specific recall, but as I recall, actually, in fact, the governor did. The governor made very specific information available, specific things that he was considering. And while the details or the specific metrics may not have been included, the actual principles of the matter were reflected in his original memorandum. Nonetheless, the House of Representatives, through the Speaker's response, was let's have a hearing. Let us take this inside, so to speak, and see if there's an arrangement that can be made in order to remove your obstruction or your interference in following through on what the legislature did. Until we read through the finality of this particular passage, which has not been completed yet, that's all I will say for now. But I am also very considerate of what was going on concurrently, wherein Benjamin Franklin was involved in an extended exegesis on the history and the foundation of paper money. And at the part we're in, which, mind you, is less than 20% of the way through the entirety of the writing, one of the substantive things that he discusses is who is interest in the circulation of paper money. Now, if we're evaluating this in consideration of the fact that concurrently there is a discussion between the governor and the legislature regarding certain aspects of this Paper Money Act, and Franklin's responses are to say, well, let us consider specifically who has an interest in the circulation of money. And what are the interests that are going to be considered when we discuss how much money to allow to circulate or how much to contract the circulation of money? A thing that comes to me immediately is consideration of information that was available at the founding of the United States. Now, granted, it's a slightly different time frame than we're talking about here. But at the onset at the beginning of the United States, one of the things that happened was as the revolutionaries were preparing for war, they needed goods. So one of the things that occurred were that certain certificates of credit were given to people who provided war goods. Now, these were all kinds of goods, up to and including armaments. In another context, I have actually developed a specific consideration of concepts of the Second Amendment implication regarding the concept of compensation or even share in ownership of facilities that are involved in the production of defense articles, specifically connected to an understanding not only of the Second Amendment, but an understanding of the Constitutional Convention, as well as an understanding of the history of revolutionary praxis in the United States as it specifically involved the banking system of the United States. And it was understood and it was reflected on by the person who was in charge of the First Mint of the United States, Dr. Benjamin Rush, that after the time frame came And the people who had provided provisions for the Revolutionary War had been provided with these certificates. It ascribed a certain value to what they produced, with an understanding that after the war was over, they were going to get paid for what they had provided. Well, the war ended. And there was a period of time where at least it was reported to them that they didn't have the money. And if they wanted to, there was some money available. Not the amount of money that the articles that they had provided were agreed to have been worth. But if they agreed to a substantial discount and they accepted a substantial discount, they could get paid now. And they could get paid in a currency that was not actually specifically legal tender currency of the United States of America. There was some other manner in which they were allowed to be given something considered to be currency or considered to be payment for what they had provided. And in exchange, they were to allow for the particular paper certificate that had guaranteed them payment for their provisions to be turned over to somebody else so that they could use it. And what happened? Well, the legislature, the first legislator of the United States of America, which is Dr. Rush recounts in his letters to others, that specifically concerning to him was that it was primarily composed of people that identified themselves as lawyers. These lawyers purchased the certificates that reflected the totality of the value that the people of the United States of America had contributed to the war effort. And they wanted them redeemed at face value. And the way they wanted them redeemed at face value was they legislatively created a concept of a bank. And they issued stock through that bank that they made available to, among others, and actually prioritized the availability of to people in other countries. Specifically countries that may or may not have supported the early revolutionary effort, but were interested in what was at that time identified as a novel model. And what the early Americans did with the banking system was unique in all the world up until that time. The traditional banking houses of Europe, for instance, or other places that had a more traditional economic system based on systems of papers of notes of credit or various concepts of bonds and what bonds meant, were not what was done in the United States. The United States did something different. And specifically what they did is they made a first round of major stock based upon the value of the contributions of the actual people of the United States. Now they had already paid the people discount rate up front. And then they, after they acquired the certifications of the actual value of the items, redeemed it at face value through these stock issues. And one of the things that happens to these stock issues were over a particular period of time, there's meant to be more. So when you bought into the first round, the understanding was you were agreeing to a commitment to buy into at least one more round down the line. And depending upon when you bought in and how much you bought, there was a greater chance that you could significantly increase the yield that would come once you repurchased stock from a new issue. And this was the early system of the banking situation in the United States at the onset. But the important thing to acknowledge is what was acknowledged by Benjamin Rush, Dr. Benjamin Rush, who, by the way, was also a person who was in charge of providing medical assistance during the war effort. One of the things that he was very concerned about, even after he had been appointed by the then president to be in charge of the First Mint of the United States, was that the people had been defrauded. The people had been defrauded. The implication was that it was known that they had enough money, or the terms could have been negotiated such that the actual people who provided the goods would have been the ones that would have been able to acquire the yield on whatever was being set up as part of the systematology of the early banking system. But they were intentionally deceived by opportunistic lawyers that somehow were allowed to get disproportionate representation in the legislature of the United States of America. And this systematology has persisted ever since. Now, this is a very significant time we're in now in the United States, which is why I'm going to go back to matters related to what what Mr. Brandeis said during his recounting about the steamships and the telegraph. I'm going to be speaking more on the telegraph later. Suffice it to say that these concurrences are very important. Manipulation of concurrent processes in order to disadvantage one group of people or one individual so as to allow for a false paradigm of leveraging to influence or advantage under false pretenses another person is very disingenuous. It's fraud. But it also has other implications on an understanding that the spirit of a nation also allows for people that are committed to commonly shared principles to have the kind of concurrence that is necessary to assure stability and to assure safety. That's why it's important for these moments to be reflected and recounted honestly, rather than to be allowed to accrue over time and for some sort of structuralist bureaucracy attempt to take it out of the realm wherein we engage in civil discourse in order to address our problems. Democracy is about more than a voting booth. And it's one of the reasons why I want to say hello to Jim. Hi, Jim. How are you? Jim Vale. He was a newspaper editor for a time. He had traveled throughout Europe. I met him when I first became a newspaper editor in Chicago. He wrote an article, one of the first issues of Streetwise newspaper that I had to lay out, had a very, very important and compelling article that he composed. Sometimes these things, they show up later. I only recently learned about the manifest that my ancestors were put on. I only recently learned. There's some other people on it. I might have liked to have had a different kind of relationship with them. But we are where we are. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.